Our Father, we are grateful for this day. Thank you for everyone who was able to make it here, Lord, and do be with each of us. Most of us are probably tired, and I pray you give us grace to be able to concentrate and be able to put our hearts into this morning, despite some physical weariness. Thank you for your love for us, and that you are good and generous and give us so many good things. I pray that you would bless this study. I pray it would be edifying, help us to learn something from it, and I pray it would be profitable and beneficial for us this morning. We love you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so this is kind of an overview of the Christianity in the 20th century, the early part of the 20th century. And I kind of want to just get us caught up briefly with where we've been at. There's been a conflict going on in Western Christianity, Western Protestantism particularly, during the early part of the 20th century. You had, on the one hand, you had liberals or moderns who wanted to, quote-unquote, update Christianity to match the sentimentality of the age. They wanted to get rid of all the supernatural elements of it and kind of turn Christianity into a moral philosophy. So Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead. He wasn't actually born of a virgin. He didn't actually do miracles. He just taught us good things. And if we apply these good things, then society will be better and your life will be better. And that was the modern view. And this modern view was creeping into literally every denomination in North America. No one came away unscathed by this. And there were two different responses to it. One was called indifferentism. These were genuine Christians, many of them godly people in many respects, who just felt we should get along with the liberals. We'll kind of live and let live. They can be here, we can be here. We'll just kind of learn to cooperate within our different denominations. And then there were fundamentalists, who believed the fundamentals and also thought the fundamentals are worth fighting for, and that it was unacceptable to have moderns in their denomination and to have liberal views taught in their denominations. I've kind of divided this history into three sections, which is purge out, come out, and burn out. So the overview is this. Initially, the conservative plan was to purge the denominations of the liberal mentality. They had varying degrees of success of that. Mostly they failed, if we're being honest. And that leads to a second phase, which is come out, which now we have to build new institutions. And unfortunately, all this is going to lead to a burnout, where things start to go a little bad. And we'll discuss that later. But just kind of a reminder, we discussed at length kind of the biblical doctrine of separation. The Bible does require genuine Christians to separate from apostasy. And apostasy is when professing Christians or professing Christian institutions deny core Christian beliefs. So apostasy is different than an apostate church is different than a false church. So, for example, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormons, they're not an apostate church, they're a false church. They've never at any point in their history been a genuine Christian church. They were a cult from day one. There are other institutions, though, who were at one point in their history good churches. And then over time, went apostate. They neglected their heritage, and they betrayed their former principles. Now, when you're on the road, though, from true church to apostate church, it's not always clear where you cross the line, right? So, like, how much sand can you pour in the sugar bowl before it's no longer a sugar bowl? And that's the question. And so if we're required to separate from apostasy, it does become a very tricky practical question of when is that required? How bad does the denomination have to get before it's time to leave? When do you stay and fight and to retake or protect your denomination? And when is it time to kind of exit? And that was a very practical, very tricky, complex question that our forefathers had to wrestle with. And we're going to be dealing with that a little bit today. The tricky thing for me is, like I said, this conflict affected literally every denomination in North America and most of them in Europe. It's very widespread, and I can't cover all of it. So what I decided to do was zero in on the ones that affect us most. We're actually going to be looking at the Northern Baptist Convention, because this church is a distant descendant of the Northern Baptist Convention. And so I thought it might be interesting to figure out where we came from. But this is not to imply that there wasn't other stuff going on. Actually, what's going on in the Presbyterian Church at this time is really interesting. So if you want to, Google that someday, do your own research on it. It's really interesting. But we're going to be focusing on the Baptists, particularly the Baptists in the northern United States, just because I can't cover everything. All right? So that's where we're going with this. Speaking of which, there's a thing called the Northern Baptist Convention. point of reference, they later changed their name to American Baptist Churches, and then they changed it again to American Baptist Churches USA. I have no idea what the USA at the end adds. What does that tell you that the American didn't tell you? I don't know, but that's what they did. So, yeah, I don't know. They just wanted to change something. The committee got bored, is my theory, and said, let's just change the name. So American Baptist Churches USA, that is the current name of what was at this time called the Northern Baptist Convention. You may have heard of the Southern Baptist Convention. All right, that still exists under that name. There was a split between the two during the 1840s. Take a guess what it was about. It was about abolition and slavery, and how does the church respond to that? All right, so just as America was fractured, American culture at large, so was the church fractured as well. And the Baptists decided they could not get along over slavery. Slavery is similar to the broader issue, or the broader conflict. Slavery was the hot button upfront issue, but there were other subtler issues going on as well, like how do you structure the different governments? Because one thing we have to discuss here is the Northern Baptist Convention and the Southern Baptist Convention are, hang with me, conventions. What's a convention? Baptists believe in the autonomy of the local church. So we believe that this church is ruled directly by Christ, and no entity other than Christ has authority over it. However, we still cooperate with other autonomous churches, and Baptists have different methods for how they do that. And the convention model is one of them. So the idea is the convention is its own institution. It's not a church, but it's in fellowship with multiple churches. The churches that are in fellowship with it send delegates, usually once a year, to a convention. They vote on things, they decide things. In theory, the convention is governed by those delegates. As we'll see, it's not always how that actually played out, but that's the theory behind it. All right, so that's the Northern Baptist Convention. Now, liberals took control of the NBC very quickly. Liberalism was much more prevalent in the North than the South, and they captured it very quickly. Conservatives in the North had no organizational structure. They had no real way of combating the changes because they weren't organized at all. In 1911, convention employees, because remember the convention is its own institution, has its own budget, has its own officers, has its own employees. Convention employees were given a vote at the annual meeting. So instead of it just being churches who send, usually like they each get 2 delegates or something, instead of just that, also every employee gets a vote. What happened was a kind of Baptist swamp, a denominational deep state, shall we say, as things tend to go, right? The bureaucracy protects itself. And as a bloc, the convention employees almost always sided with the liberals because they had interest in maintaining the status quo of the bureaucracy. And so this made it very hard for the conservatives to accomplish anything. I want to just illustrate this by going through a few of the conventions that took place. There's annual conventions, usually at different cities, once a year. And they vote on things. And both liberals and conservatives try to get stuff done at these conventions. This is important because a lot of how evangelicals talk about fundamentalism is the fundamentalists were just stuffy and probably scared and cowardly and didn't want to fight, and so they just jettisoned the denominations as soon as things went bad. That's not true. The conservatives spent a better part of a century trying to reform these things from within, and we'll see how that played out. So let's take, for example, the 1919 convention in Denver, Colorado. There was a very aggressive liberal agenda. They pushed an explicit statement saying that the church's mission was primarily social. So the church exists as a social function, not to save souls. That was the official position of the NBC as of 1919. There was also the creation of what's called the M&M program, which has nothing to do with candy. I was disappointed to find out. It's a retirement program. M&M stands for like missionaries and ministers, I think. It was a retirement program. So it is you pay this pension, and then the convention holds this, and then they pay out retirement for missionaries and pastors, which on the surface sounds like a good idea. The problem was this ended up being used as leverage to control pastors and missionaries, because if you leave the convention or don't play ball with the convention, we can cut your pension. And so it was used as leverage. So what we'll see as we go on, when the split finally happened, it was mostly young men who did it, because they had less to lose, because they weren't as tied into the convention. So that happened as well. There was the creation of an official NBC newspaper, which allowed them to kind of perpetuate their positions on things. So after that, the conservatives were like, oh boy, we gotta do something here because we're getting walloped. So in 1920, there's a convention in Buffalo, New York, and the fundamentalists say, let's try to fight back. They formed something called the Brooklyn Convention, or the Brooklyn Committee, because they met in Brooklyn, to discuss a strategy. And then they proceeded to do absolutely nothing with that strategy. I don't know, conservatives are bad at this. I don't know if it's just that I am a conservative, so I noticed this, but I feel like we're bad at politics in general. And church politics is no different. I don't know, we don't know how to do this stuff very well. We kind of see that's a theme. We're kind of, I don't know. I think we're not sneaky is maybe part of it. And so we just get walloped by sneaky people. Austin has an opinion on this, I think.
I was just going to say, I think that the biggest reason is very close to the fact that we're not sneaky.
Yeah. Yep. No, I think that's right. I think we're too honest and trusting. So the Buffalo Convention is a perfect example of this. The conservatives held an open meeting that anyone could attend to discuss their plan. And of course, there were a lot of liberals in the meeting taking notes. Meanwhile, the liberals are holding a secret meeting to discuss how to counter the strategy that we told them we were going to do. And it didn't work. And throughout this, you'll see there's a lot of trying to do tit for tat of we'll give you this, you give us this. And so we give them this, and they don't give us that. And that happened for 50 years in the Northern Baptist Convention. So that's what's going on. There's also something called the Fundamentalist Fellowship that was formed as a reform movement, not a separatist movement, but a reform movement within the NBC. So in the next year, there's a convention, a place you may have heard of, called Des Moines, Iowa. One of the things I love, actually, about studying fundamentalist history is that most of church history takes place in the Middle East and Europe. If it's in the U.S. at all, it's like the East Coast. Most of fundamentalist history happens in places you've been to. Des Moines, Chicago, Grand Rapids, these are the big centers of these events. So I think that's kind of fun. So in Des Moines, there's a fight over a confessional statement. Baptists have an interesting history with confessions. We believe very strongly in personal responsibility and the autonomy of the local church. So those two things kind of go together, that I'm responsible to accept Jesus. You can't make me do it. My parents can't make me do it. My church can't make me do it. That's my responsibility. And then churches govern themselves. So this raises a question, then should we then demand that individuals and churches subscribe to a doctrinal statement? And on the one hand, Baptists kind of have bristled against that. Some of them have, because of our commitment to personal responsibility. At the same time, about as long as Baptists have existed, we've been writing doctrinal statements. So there's a very long history of this. So kind of save that for later. There's a guy named J.C. Massey. He called for the formation of an official doctrinal statement for the NBC. The result was something called the Good Child Confession, and it's frankly quite moderate. On the passage on Scripture, there's no mention of inerrancy. Jesus' birth is called miraculous, but it doesn't say he was born of a virgin. The return of Christ was called visible, but it left the millennial issue completely unaddressed. However, it was still too orthodox for liberals. The liberals still couldn't sign it, right? And this is going to set up a fight down the road. Next year, we go to Indianapolis for our convention. J.C. Massey, as I mentioned, he's the leader of the Fundamentalist Fellowship, but he's fairly moderate in his tone and tactics. He wanted to reform the NBC from within, and he was loyal to the denomination. He valued unity and reconciliation. So this kind of sets itself up for some tension between him and another man named Oliver Van Osdale. He wanted a more aggressive stance. He was the pastor of Wealthy Street Baptist Church in Grand Rapids. It's really one of the unsung heroes of the movement. I wanted to find a picture of him. I think I'm completely going to my slides. There you go. That's what's going on in the Northern Baptist Convention. I tried to find a picture of him, and I couldn't because he's so unknown. One of the sources I used was a book called One in Hope and Doctrine by Kevin Bowder and Robert Delnay. It was actually their research that uncovered his role in all these events. It was pretty much unknown prior to this point. But he had a huge role in this, as we'll see. By the time the Indianapolis Convention comes along, he's 72. And he's already lived his life. He's done everything. He was a Civil War veteran. He pastored most of his life. He's raised his kids. He's ready to retire. He's done his thing. But the leadership of the fundamentalists is so weak, he feels he can't. Because if he steps back, there's kind of no one left. So he's the one guy pushing for a more aggressive stance within the convention. So meanwhile, this year in Indianapolis, a liberal named Harry Emerson Fosdick preached a famous sermon called Shall the Fundamentalists Win? And the the implication is, well, of course we can't let that happen. That would be terrible if we let the fundamentalists win. And he really goaded the conservatives into making some, crude remarks, some uncharitable remarks, shall we say. So a conservative then gets up and preaches a message called, "Shall the funny monkeyist win?" Which is like, it's supposed to be a pun on evolution, and okay, but it kind of came across as kind of crass, and kind of made the conservatives look bad. Meanwhile, the theme of the convention is agreed to differ but resolved to love. So that was the tone they're trying to set, right? Guys, let's just get along, and that was kind of the pervasive attitude at the time. So as this is going on, a motion is made to allow churches to send delegates only if they gave money to the convention. And this is a direct slap to the fundamentalists, because one of the ethical issues they were having is, we pour money into this convention fund, and the convention fund goes to all sorts of different things. Once it's in the pot, the convention controls it. And it goes to many things that we don't support. So many liberal causes and things that we just can't get behind. So they were starting to form their own institutions. They had their own Bible colleges they were starting. They had their own mission agencies. But the convention's like, hey, if you give money to those instead of us, you can't send delegates anymore. And so it's power grabs, trying to force the conservatives out. So what the fundamentalists do is they attempt to offer a doctrinal statement, official doctrinal statement for the MBC. And they pick the New Hampshire Baptist Confession. This was written in 1833, and it's on the whole a good confession. Not to be picky, there's like 4 words I would change. But on the whole, it's certainly an orthodox confession. It accurately portrays the core doctrines of the Christian faith. Robert Ketchum describes the meeting in which this was proposed amongst the fundamentalists. So this is what we're going to do. And remember the name Robert Ketchum. He's going to come into this later. This is Ketchum talking. He says, Dr. Joshua Gravant of Colorado was asked to read the old New Hampshire Confession to us. We shall never forget that night. We questioned if there was a dry eye anywhere among the 300 present. As Dr. Gravin read in our presence those soul-stirring sentences which portrayed the faith of our Baptist fathers and which were almost the full expression of the faith and hope of every man in the room, it seemed as though the glory of the Lord came down upon us. We had been in few meetings in our lives where the presence of God was more deeply manifest, unquote. I just love the idea that they were just so moved by this doctrine, so hungry for truth, that the reading of a confession moved them to tears. So that's what the conservatives propose. Guys, let's make this our official doctrinal statement. And it would have functionally forced out all the liberals, because they could not have honestly signed it because of the content of it. Now, what the conservatives were hoping would happen is that would be the fight. Do you or do you not accept the doctrines of the New Hampshire Confession? Because that would force the liberals to, at the very least, come out on record saying they don't support it. So that was part of the problem, is they were being kind of dubious and saying, well, we do believe these things, but then defining them in weird ways. So it would get everyone on record, was the idea. The liberals countered with this proposal. This is a direct quote from the minutes. The Northern Baptist Convention affirms that the New Testament is the all-sufficient ground of our faith and practice, and we need no other statement. That's their proposal. That sounds pretty nice, right? It sounds nice to say the New Testament is the all-sufficient ground of our faith and practice, which, okay, we do believe. But then the next part is, and we need no other statement. I'll throw it to you. Do you notice anything about that? Is there anything about that that's... Any red flags going off for you? Yeah, Ryan? Yep, exactly. So it means absolutely nothing. It can be whatever you want it to mean. So, yeah, certainly that. And that's the whole point, right? Is it just creates this murk. Well, yeah, exactly. What's one to identify and say as Baptist at all if it doesn't mean a thing? The other irony here is that statement is a doctrinal statement. It's a pretty lousy one because, like I said, it means nothing. But it is a doctrinal statement that you will not find in the New Testament. So there's no way around having doctrinal statements. You just have to have them. It's the way it is. And so you might as well have ones that are clear and precise and tell you something about what you actually believe. But it was a clever move on the part of the liberals, because how it's framed is you don't have to pick between the New Hampshire Confession and the New Testament. Right? That's how it got framed. So instead of arguing about the content of the New Hampshire Confession, we're now arguing about whether or not you accept the New Testament. That's how it was framed. So after 3 hours of the debate, the fundamentalists lost by a vote of 637 to 1,240 or 64. So 2-1. And no one was expecting that. Not the liberals, not the conservatives. They got walloped majorly in ways that no one saw coming. And it completely deflated them. It took everyone off guard. And they began to come to the conclusion that this is where we're at as a convention. Maybe it can't be saved. So that leads us to another movement called the Bible Baptist Union. So remember, this is tension between Massey and Van Osdale. Massey wanted to take a more moderate tone. Van Osdale wanted to be more aggressive. And Osdale warned Massey. They actually had an interesting relationship. They were actually very friendly in private. Like they had lunch together. They wrote affirming letters to each other saying, hey, praying for your ministry. In public, they were quite aggressive towards each other. It's actually an interesting thing. And I think an example actually of how to fight charitably, because they pulled no punches, but also somehow managed to maintain a friendship during that, which is pretty remarkable. But anyway, Van Osdale, in good faith, warned him, say, hey, Massey, you're going to have to start doing something or I'm going to do it myself. So just FYI, that's where we're at. So after that convention was over, Van Osdale and a guy named Robert E. Neighbor met with some others in a hotel room for prayer and strategy. Together they formed a committee that sent out a call of support from Baptist churches. They were hoping for 50 signatures. They got 135. What formed was a new alliance called the Bible Baptist Union. And what this did, it was a broad alliance of basically all North American Baptists, but what it allowed you to do was to stay in your convention. So you didn't have to leave. You could if you wanted to, but you didn't have to leave. But you could also be in fellowship with the Bible Baptist Union. Oliver Van Osdale describes the purpose of this union. He says, quote, the Bible Baptist Union proposes a fellowship of Baptist churches and Baptist believers untrammeled by unholy and unscriptural alliances. And this really was a broad movement in terms of geography. So you had Oliver Van Osdale, who really represents the northern United States. He pastored his whole life in Michigan. He literally fought for the North during the Civil War, and he represents that kind of style of ministry. Then you have a guy named J. Frank Norris, who will become important later. Again, tuck that name away. He pastored First Baptist Church of Fort Worth, Texas, which at the time was the largest church in America. Very flamboyant personality. He was also a pioneer in radio ministry, which was like a new thing at the time. He had his own newspaper, so very influential man. And his church was expelled from the Southern Baptist Convention because he had clashes with the leadership. Then you have a guy named Thomas Todd Hunter Shields, which I think is a great name for some reason. He's Canadian, and he pastored Jarvis Street Baptist Church in Toronto. All the churches back then were either first or named after streets. That's just how they did it back then. And so he pastored that church, very large church in Toronto. And so between them, they kind of gave voice to all North American Baptists. Initially, the BBU attracted leadership of A.C. Dixon. If you remember from last week, we talked about the fundamental papers. He was the guy who edited those. So initially, he was like the president of this thing. But he resigned after clashes with Norris, which will become a pattern, as we'll see. Norris had a hard time getting along with people. It did take a while for the BBU to separate from the Northern Baptist Convention, however. And one of the critical moments of that separation, one of the big moments in North American Baptist history, happens right there. You want to recognize that place?
Oh, yeah.
Yep, that's Second and Euclid. Yep, you guys used to live over there. Okay, so you guys know where we're at. Like I said, this touches places we know. This was going to be actually like a huge event. It's going to happen in that building. It is a pawn shop now. Yep. It used to be Des Moines University. No relation to the current institution called Des Moines University. Completely different. And I have a prop today, because I found this at Brass Armadillo. This is a bulletin from the last year they were open. So I was quite. No one else wanted it because no one knows what this is, but I knew what it was, and I grabbed it. This is a bulletin from Des Moines University from the year 1928. So I think it's pretty cool. It's almost 100 years old, and so there we go. Highland Park, Des Moines, Iowa. It says. So what's up with Second and Euclid? Well, Des Moines University was founded in Highland Park in 1889, and as you see, it met at Second and Euclid. It came under the control of the Iowa Baptist Convention in 1921. So that's the state wing of the Northern Baptist Convention. But the school was in debt and dying. It actually tried to merge with Drake, but Drake's like, we don't want your debt, so go away. And so that didn't work out. So now the school is kind of in trouble. Through a mutual acquaintance, T.T. Shields was a Canadian guy, he was able to negotiate the purchase of the school by the Bible Baptist Union. The theory was this would allow the BBU to build an educational institution that could train people to either take back the Northern Baptist Convention or to form something new. Because the problem is the liberals control all of the seminaries at this time, which means eventually they control the churches, right? Because if you're the guy training the pastors, eventually you control the churches. So this was the conservatives' attempt to reform, to create a new institution or to take control of an institution that they could train people of their own, which in theory was a sound enough strategy. So this was the deal. The BBU would take control of the university if they assumed all the indebtedness and could raise $50,000 for the university's operating expenses. The BBU moved quickly. At their business meeting, they managed to raise half the funds necessary and had a good plan for raising the rest. So they moved quick on this. So what they did is BBU members, including Van Osdale, were put on the board, and they elected Shields as their president. Bowder and Delnay, they describe the situation here. Shields was really the guy who kind of took the reins on this, and this is what they say. To move so quickly, Shields was forced to ignore good counsel. Riley, he's a Minnesotan pastor. He wired Shields, cautioning him against taking on the debt from the old administration. He saw no reason to, quote, pay off the debts of the Northern Baptist Convention, unquote. Shields also submitted his data to C.J. Holman, a lawyer who was a member of Jarvis Street. Holman wrote back a densely typed 4-page paper listing 9 reasons against the takeover of Des Moines University. Then Holman followed up his initial letter with at least 2 and possibly 3 more reasons. His attitude from beginning to end can be summarized in his closing words. I am sending you this last word of advice before you go to Des Moines. Don't. And the words get bigger each time he says don't. And then Bowder and Delnay go on, though. They said, in what probably counts as a statement about his knowledge of his pastor's character, Holman also enclosed a check for $50 towards the project. So he says, don't, but I know you're going to do it anyway, so here's $50. Hope it works out for you. So initially, it seemed like the gamble paid off, or at least had the potential to. They hired new teachers, all of who could sign the BBU doctrinal statement. Some teachers did object. Apparently most of their College of Pharmacy resigned, and they formed a new college, which is now actually the Drake University College of Pharmacy and Health Science. So Baptist inadvertently started that college in Drake, just so you know. The BBU secretary, who was a woman named Edith Redman, and she was close with Shields. She was also Canadian. She was made the on-site manager and had almost absolute practical authority over the school. Because remember, Shields is pastoring in Canada, so he can't be in Des Moines managing everything. So Redmond does all the groundwork here in Des Moines. So far, sitting pretty good. Then problems begin to arise. It's pretty clear as you kind of go through the minutes and the notes that the board had no experience running a school. The board guys ran way over their heads. And I'm not judging. I wouldn't know how to do it either, but they just really didn't know what they were doing. They toyed publicly with the idea of shutting down all sports and clubs, which didn't make them super popular with the student body. Part of the problem, and really the root problem, was the board wanted a robust fundamentalist Baptist school. That's what they were going for. But most of the students came from a variety of Protestant backgrounds, and even some were Roman Catholics, Mormon, and Jewish. So there's this lack of cohesion amongst the student body. They still got the financial problems they're dealing with. There's still a lot of debt. Many of the teachers were indifferentists who, while they agreed with the new board on paper, they did not like the militant tone the board was taking. During one of the chapels, Shields preached a stirring gospel message. And it seemed like a good thing. Half the student body went forward and made decisions. What no one seemed to notice is that means half the body didn't. And there was this tension between the two. Again, quoting Bowder and Delnay again, they said some students responded and were drawn into a deeper Christian faith. Others reacted and began to take a more dismissive attitude towards those who promoted the revival. This difference could hardly fail to produce tensions between the students, or especially between some students and the administration. So again, there's this more incohesion between everyone. This is further amplified by a weird U.S.-Canadian rivalry, which doesn't make sense to me. So Shields and Redmond are Canadian, but most of the faculty and students are American. This is the 1920s. Post-World War I, nationalism is very high in the U.S. And Shields, as we'll see, he wasn't the most tactful individual. He made a disparaging joke about George Washington on George Washington's birthday, which I didn't appreciate. He also wanted to sing God Save the King during chapel, which is weird for a school in Iowa to say God Save the King. But when they did sing the American national anthem, he and Redmond refused to stand for it. There were reports of Canadian students being hazed. Some of the students in the engineering department, go figure, greased the flagpole to prevent the stars and stripes from being lowered. And the Des Moines Fire Department had to be called in to remedy the situation. So this weird kind of angst going on in the school. And as mentioned, Shields just really lacked a lot of tact. He would regularly get into public confrontations with his teachers. At one point, he grabbed the dean of students by the lapels and shook him in front of the entire school. He may have been motivated by an honest zeal for truth, but his tactics turned a lot of people off. Meanwhile, Redmond was also making herself unpopular by being very heavy-handed in her administration. She reportedly had a network of campus spies keeping an eye on the faculty and students, which again, all this goes to not make you super popular. So then we get to 1928, and things kind of finally reach a boiling point. Shields met Redmond in Des Moines for breakfast at a local restaurant. I tried to find which restaurant it was, and I could not. I looked through all the records I have, and I couldn't find it. Somewhere in Des Moines, they met at a restaurant to discuss business, because that's, but the restaurant happened to be located underneath a hotel. And a university staff member saw them leave the hotel together, which started a vicious rumor of adultery. The board was called in to investigate the matter. After hearing the evidence and finding that there really wasn't any, they exonerated both Shields and Redmond. But this wasn't the result the students were wanting, or the faculty for that matter. At this point, things have come to a head. The faculty demands that Shields and Redmond be fired for their authoritarian approach to leadership. Shields responds by making a motion to fire the entire faculty. At the end of the year, every position would be declared vacant. Anyone who wished to keep their job could apply to Miss Redmond. The idea was to kind of purge, and if you want to grovel to us, we'll consider it. Okay? Again, not making anyone super happy right now. The students sided with the teachers. They gathered in the chapel, they passed a resolution supporting the faculty, and wore little American pins, flag pins, as a sign of protest. Things keep escalating. During a board meeting, students march on 2nd and Euclid, where the board is meeting, armed with rotten eggs from a local farmer. They begin throwing the eggs into the windows. They shut the windows. They start throwing rocks. The board is running from room to room, avoiding the volley. Finally, they find themselves in a closet, locked up there to avoid the threats. The mob is yelling, "Get Shields," and beat him. Afterwards, people on both sides believe that if the mob had gotten a hold of Shields, they would have murdered him. That's the level of tension we're talking here. The riot lasted for, what's that? Yeah, exactly. Very Christian approach on all sides. Everyone is doing great. The riot lasted for 40 minutes. This, to be honest, was not the finest hour of the Des Moines Police Department. Shields, being Shields, had made a lot of enemies in the Des Moines city, government. And so they were called in. 2 cops kind of walked around and talked to students for a little bit and then went home. And then proceeded to do nothing. So for 40 minutes, things lasted. Finally, the mob dispersed kind of on their own accord. The board, which is still technically in session, and some of the image is horrible and comical at once, all these men in suits and ties huddled in a closet, still technically in session. And they're all in favor of closing the school? Yeah, so just it closed indefinitely at that moment. Police finally do show up after everyone's gone already, and the board is escorted to the police station in squad cars for their protection. The police say, no, we can't protect Shields unless he's physically in the station, though. And so he actually sneaks out in the dead of night and goes back to Toronto. The DMU, the Des Moines University, was the last attempt to reform the embassy from within. And it failed in such spectacular fashion that it became evident to everyone that they need to form a new fellowship. You may have heard of this one. It's called the General Association of Regular Baptist Churches. So the BBU is in shambles. Van Osdale, who's now 82, he stepped up to provide some final leadership. So what's going on at this point is the separation's already begun. There's all these state conventions that are leaving the national convention, and there's all these new like Bible institutes and mission agencies cropping up. However, there's no like national institution. There's no national network that's been formed. Van Osdale, because no one else would, called for a meeting of these various state fellowships. He's like, guys, we're all doing our thing. Let's all get together and figure this out. Side note, one of the institutions they started at this time was called Omaha Bible Institute. It's actually where my grandparents graduated. They eventually outgrew their facility in Omaha, and so they bought some land in a cornfield in Ankeny. You can't call it Omaha Bible Institute anymore, so they renamed it Faith Baptist Bible College. So faith actually comes right during this time. The year after the whole thing at Des Moines, I believe. There were some concerns. No one was interested in yet another top-down denomination. They got so burnt out on that with the NBC, like we're not doing that again. There's also a growing concern about what someone called the great man approach to Christian leadership, which is you have one very charismatic personality running everything. And we'll talk about that more next week, but that's beginning to be a real problem, particularly among Baptists for some reason. I don't know why, but it was a big problem at this time. But no one was interested in that. Van Osdale in particular was very committed to shared leadership and kind of a multiplicity of leaders rather than one guy being on top. Another part of this is they needed some kind of infrastructure to survive without the aid of the big convention. This is the middle of the Great Depression. Most Baptist churches were poor and needed help to do things like missions and higher education. So the Bible Baptist Union has one last meeting at Belden Avenue in Chicago. There they formed a new fellowship of churches called the General Association of Regular Baptist Churches. I'm kind of chopping up the name a little bit. What's a general association? Well, it's different than a convention. Everyone's very tired of conventions at this point. For one, it's a fellowship of churches, and the idea is the churches send messengers, not delegates. And it seems like kind of a subtle difference, but the point being made is a delegate implies they have delegated authority, right? A messenger just sends messages. So the idea is the messengers would go and they'd relay the wishes of the churches, but once the vote was cast, that vote had no binding authority on the churches. The churches could still accept or reject the resolutions made by the association. Also, an association, in contrast with a convention, does not control church funds, does not control the pastoral pension plans. It would recommend Bible colleges and mission agencies, but it wouldn't own any of them. That was another key difference that they insisted upon. Side note here, I was in a church, like my entire growing up years, that had regular Baptist in the name. I did not know what that meant until I was in my 20s. So if you're curious, a regular Baptist church, in contrast with an irregular Baptist church, I suppose, just means a real Baptist church. So there's all these liberal Baptist churches that were denying core doctrines. The point we made is you're regular if you actually believe this stuff, if you actually adhere to traditional Christian and Baptist doctrine. So regular Baptist is just a real Baptist. So it's a little redundant, but the point is that they're intentionally being redundant. It's like we're the regular Baptist. It's these guys who've gone weird. Again, quoting Bowder and Delnay, they say the meeting hardly seemed auspicious, talking about the meeting in Chicago. 30-odd messengers from 20-some congregations attracted no newspaper headlines. Nevertheless, the Belden Avenue meeting represented a turning point in Baptist fundamentalism. Within this meeting, the separatists began to construct both the superstructure and an infrastructure that they would need if they were going to survive outside the convention. The GRBC grew rapidly, and within a decade, it had become one of the most important organizations within Baptist fundamentalism. But I like this phrase from Van Osdale. Remember, he's the guy who started this whole thing. He says, if the GRBC ever goes liberal, I will leave it too. So it's kind of that was the attitude, and I think a good attitude is that we shouldn't be too loyal to any one particular institution, but rather the truth itself. As we see the direction the GRBC is currently going, his admonition may prove relevant. At some point, there may be time to leave the GRBC as well. because their allegiance is to truth, not to the particular institution. Harry Hamilton was elected its first president. Then Robert Ketchum, remember I quoted him earlier, he was elected as the second and last president. Like, but wait, doesn't the GRBC still exist? Do they not have a president? Stay tuned for next time. So we'll delve into that. I do want to make some practical applications. I've not moved any of this. That's just defining all those terms. General Association, Constitutional Convention, regular Baptist churches, and then the RFL is about churches, not individuals. So I, as an individual, cannot become a member of the GRBC, but our church could. And that's different. The reason behind that is that it was trying to rest the power in the churches rather than in particular individuals. And that distinction will become important for a showdown that will take place next time. But I'm going to make some practical takeaways. What do we all do with this? So in the face of apostasy, true Christians must oppose it. They can either purge out heresy or they can come out and form new institutions. And I really do think both are acceptable. Both can be done in a God-honoring way. It really does become a strategic choice about when do you do which. And that's a hard judgment call to make. And people will be on different sides of that. And they feel we just can't win here anymore and we need to go somewhere else. Whereas if no, we stay and fight and retake the structures that are already in place. Fundamentalists spent the better part of the last century trying to reform the MBC, and they failed. The come-out phase was, again, it was not a quick reaction to inconvenience. I hear many people say this a lot. That's just blatantly false. The fundamentalists tried very, very hard to reform it. I will grant they weren't great at it, but it wasn't just lack of trying. They did try and failed, and so they felt they had to go somewhere else. I find it interesting. There's a reason I have this hung up in my office. Like this. Now that you know the story about the Des Moines University, it's like, why would you actually want a relic from there? But I find this interesting, that the GRBC literally rose out of a riot. That they came up out of a very bad situation. And it says something, I think, about the perseverance of these saints. They could have given up. They could have thrown in the towel. I do admire they stuck with it and continued even after such a setback. But it is a cautionary tale, though, as well. We do see how, like, a lot of petty issues, a lot of personal conflicts, a lot of heavy-handed leadership, some egotism, it can really sabotage the work of Christ. The effort was a good effort. It should have been done well, but because people were just petty and let their pride get in the way and things like that, things got out of control much quicker than they would need to, and it really set back the work. And so as we face the challenges of the 21st century, I think we can learn from their example. We are going to have to make a judgment call. When do we stay in institutions and fight, and when do we leave them and start new ones? And that is, that's a hard decision to make and take some wisdom. We should persevere. I don't think we should let setbacks completely demoralize us. We should persevere and keep on the fight. But we also need to be cautious and not let silly things get in the way of the work of Christ, and not let petty kind of interpersonal issues become a problem. And so I think those are some things that we can learn from the example of the Baptists of the last century. Your thoughts, comments, questions, concerns, anything you think is noteworthy from this discussion? All right. Well, thank you very much. I find this stuff interesting. Hopefully you do too. So now you all know we are a part of an association formed out of a riot. So that's our heritage there. All right, let's pray, and then we can transition to the next service. Our Father, we are grateful for people of the past. We acknowledge successes and failures from our history, and we know that you work these things towards good, that you are faithful to build your church despite the failings of your people. And I ask you would do that in this age as well. Despite our frailties, despite our sinfulness even, you would use this church, churches like it, to accomplish your work in this generation. And we trust that you will do it as we are humble, as we remain faithful to you, and seek to do what's right. You will use our efforts, weak as they are, to accomplish good things. Father, please bless our morning service, and I pray you'd give us all just hearts to worship you and to serve one another. We love you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all.